I am reading from chapter 11 of Hebrews, and it says selected verses because you may enjoy reading the whole chapter for yourself. But I'm going to hit the highlights simply because that's what the author of Hebrews was doing as well. He was putting his own spin on his faith family tree, hitting the highlights of those who are known to us from the first 6, 7, 8 books of the Old Testament. And you and I know that one could spend a lot more time than these 40 verses summarizing the work of the saints. But let me begin with those crucial early verses, beginning at verse 1, 2, and 3. To have faith is to be sure of the things we hope for, to be certain of the things we cannot see. It was by their faith that people of ancient times won God's approval. And he begins to enumerate Abel and Cain, Enoch, Noah. Think about Noah as a great illustration of this idea that he was building an ark for an occasion that no one could see with their eyes, and yet in trust, he was prepared for the future that God would bring. Abraham, who left home without MapQuest or GPS, hard to imagine these days, and then later into his life with Sarah, they continued to make room in their lives for the child who would be born to their old age and would fulfill the promise of descendants when they had been without children for so very long. And then as we arrive at verse 13, the author of Hebrews says it was in faith that all these persons died. They did not receive the things that God had promised, but from a long way off they saw them and welcomed them, and admitted openly that they were foreigners and refugees on earth. Those who say such things make it very clear, that they are looking for a country of their own. They did not keep thinking about the country they had left. If they had, they would have had the chance to return. Instead, it was a better country they longed for, the heavenly country. And so God is not ashamed for them to call him their God, because he has preserved and prepared a city for them. Further on, he dwells on difficult subjects, like the offering of Isaac by Abraham on the mountain. The story of Joseph, who could foresee the time when his descendants would be slaves of Egypt, and also providing for an exodus that would be led by somebody as unlikely as Moses. All of them were keeping their eyes on God's future. They trusted God would give them a place to live, a place to plant their lives. And here it mentions the conquest of what we think of as the land of milk and honey, the land of Canaan. And I think it's really amazing that in describing the Battle of Jericho, he doesn't mention Joshua, the one we sing about. He mentions Rahab, who's a woman of the night, of the oldest profession, who befriends the people of God and is part of giving over her city to what we would think of as the city of God's planting. There are more, and that's the lovely thing about Hebrews. The author says there's more and more and more, and so you should read about them for yourself, or you should learn their stories so you can tell their stories to your children. For here you'll find superheroes even more exciting than Supergirl, though I understand she is quite the person of the moment. And then in conclusion, in verses 39 and 40, he says, what a record all of these have won by their faith, yet they did not receive what God had promised. Isn't that interesting? They didn't receive all that God had promised. They lived in that gap between the promise and its fulfillment. Because God had decided on an even better plan for us. His purpose was that only in company with us would they be made perfect. And here the word, both in Hebrew and in Greek, the word perfect means complete. So you and I are part of this lovely family tree of faith. And in our own part with it, we receive all that has been given to us until now. But we are also looking forward, and we know that we are part of the ultimate completion of all that God intends for us. When I had my biggest challenge in leading and teaching confirmation, and I know that over the generations, confirmation has been provided here for young people at an age when it's important for young people to make decisions of their own. While I was at Franklin First, nearly 20 years ago, we would have 45 to 50 young people in the 6th grade. This was no small challenge. I grew up in a small church, and in my small church, in my small town of Erin, Tennessee, I remember vividly the pastor who gathered a group of us of several ages and met with us once a week after school at our church, where I got off the bus, and he spent weeks and weeks as our teacher. And I remember knowing that I had been tutored by somebody that I loved and looked up to, somebody whose sermons had brought alive to me the stories of even the Old Testament. I still remember Brother Jim and the love and the care he had in preparing us to make a decision. And I remember being free to make that decision sometime in the coming months or years when I felt that I was ready. Brother Jim continued to follow my ministry, and he was a supportive man who had been a superintendent of a district, and I will always be grateful that he never for a moment questioned that God was calling me when I began to explore that call in the 1960s and 70s in this immediate area of the Methodist Church. Brother Jim died with cancer when my ministry was still very young, but I'll never forget my last visit with him because I was given the chance to thank him for all the ways that his prayer and his preparation had followed me through my whole life of faith, even though he was only our pastor for 4 years in Erin, Tennessee. When I began to train people to be faith friends for these 45 to 56 graders, I held required training sessions for the faith friends. I knew that if we were going to have a deepening experience for these young people, we would need a class that would last the whole school year. We would need experiences that gave them the chance to become disciples and practice the things that disciples do, and that they would need someone who was not a parent, who was committed to be their spiritual guide and their mentor throughout that year. When such persons were nominated and vetted and qualified, we trained them very carefully. But my favorite part of training faith friends was to bring to mind the most important teachers they would have throughout that year, the teachers they would need to be a faithful adult guide for a young person. I said, Brother Jim died long ago, but Brother Jim is still with me. And there are many times when I will ask myself, what would Brother Jim choose to do? What would he say? How would he support me? And I said to them, and I say this to you today, every person in this room has someone like Brother Jim who has been there for you. And this saint is waiting for you to continue the listening journey of love and relationship that goes beyond death and continues throughout our life of faith. I would say to you that today I will be lighting a candle for a woman who turned out to be my mentor. She was 62 years old, the age that I am now, when the most pivotal part of our relationship took place. I had gone to work with her at the state hospital, Middle Tennessee Mental Health Institute, She had told me I needed to get to know a real good Methodist there, Mona McNutt. And I mentioned Mona to you all when I was here earlier this year. Mona and I served on a team together for one of the units where I was the intern chaplain. But my beloved mentor, the Reverend Dr. Faith Cornwall, had already established a very loving and strong career as a chaplain of a very large state hospital with, at times, more than 2,000 patients. I signed on to work under her supervision in 1978 and would continue to do so for 3 years, the last 2 years of which I was a paid full-time intern. And through that time, she taught me all kinds of things about mental illness and about how to honor every person, no matter how frail, no matter how hard to love, no matter how unpredictable their life might be. She even taught me something I still do today, and that is I try and wear closed-toe shoes when I'm doing my work as a minister. She said at the time it was very important that you not make it easy for somebody to step on your toes. Isn't that good advice? You know, it works on more than one level. Many of the people who are there for us, they're still with us when we put on our shoes in the morning. And I think Gabe and I, as pastors, need to be sure that we don't easily get our toes stepped on, because people need us. And they don't need us to get angry or reactive. But I will tell you one closing story about my mentor, especially because she died since last All Saints, well into her 90s. I was about to become a mother, and she was about to become retired. I was 28 years old, and I had worked past my due date, and everyone on the treatment teams were nervous about sitting with me when I was so ready to deliver our first son. And I went into labor early on a Friday morning. Early on that Friday morning, I called in and I let her know that I wouldn't be coming to work that day. And she said, "Oh, I'm so grateful that the time has come." And then I didn't stay in touch with her. I labored all of that Friday from the wee hours. And then late Friday, my doctor said, "Well, I think you ought to go to the hospital." And into Saturday morning, the labor continued. And the labor continued into Saturday afternoon. And by Saturday afternoon, my doctor had discerned that our baby boy, we didn't know it was a boy back in those days, you had no idea what was going to happen. I had no idea that our baby would be okay, because there were all the signs that he was in distress from a prolonged labor that was not making much progress. And it was a scary time because 34 years ago, daddies weren't allowed to go into the operating room when my doctor decided that we needed an emergency C-section. We were so frightened. My husband had been with me through all of the labor. He'd been a wonderful coach and a wonderful pillar of strength. But all of a sudden, we were about to be separated, and I would be taken into an operating room with no assurance of how our baby would be when he was born. Needless to say, at that stage in my life, that was one of the most frightening moments I have ever entered. And just before I was wheeled into the operating room, there was a knock on the door, and it was my mentor, the Reverend Dr. Faith Cornwall. She was there. At the moment Jeff and I needed her most, she gathered us up spiritually, and she gathered us up with a spoken prayer, holding our hands, committing everything we needed into God's care. And I went into the delivery trusting in a new and deeper way than I could have possibly believed on my own. Now, the baby boy was born, and luckily no big problems had ensued. And he's 34 years old and 6'5", and he's the father of a just 1-year-old. He's brought a lot of joy to my life. But I'll never forget what happened about a month later when I was thinking about going back to work and being able to say goodbye to my colleagues at the hospital. And I spoke with Faith. That's her name. I said, There were a number of people who checked on us. One of my friends went to me twice in labor and said, "Why haven't you had this baby yet?" And I said, I'm still friends with her in spite of the fact that she wasn't any help to me when I was going through this very traumatic experience. How did you know? Did someone call you? How did you know to come at that moment? And she said words to me that are still part of my life. She said, "Well, I've been in prayer for you since the time I knew your labor had begun." And that prayer had continued. And on Saturday afternoon, I had a strong prompting of the Holy Spirit that I needed to come to you. And I didn't know why. And of course, when I got there, I realized why God had prompted me to make that visit. And after that day, I have said over and over again to myself, I want that kind of faith, and I want that kind of life in prayer. So that prayer is not just a party between me and God, but that prayer is a foundation for the ways God will prompt us to serve and to love all who come into our path, to whom we are uniquely sent. May you and I learn to listen for the saints, whether they're still living, whether they have passed on to glory. I love that phrase, because I have no doubt that the Reverend Dr. Faith Cornwall has passed on to glory. And what a joy to me that our paths were joined now and in the colony of God's heaven forever. Amen.